They buried him at sundown. By dawn, she'd dug him up. No prayers, no hymns, just the sound of a shovel's edge striking against dry, hollow earth. Each scoop was heavy, like she was clawing through the weight of her own sins. The lantern beside her flickered low, casting shadows across the crooked gravestones. In that silence, the hollow itself seemed to breathe, slow, expectant, waiting for her to finish what the rest of them feared to start. They thought death had claimed him clean. They thought dirt and wood could hold what he knew, what he'd done, but she wasn't the kind of woman to let the ground keep secrets. And as the coffin lid cracked, as the smell of rot bled out into the night, she struck the match. Flame kissed wood, and a coffin became a pyre. Smoke curled high into the black sky, and every crow within a mile scattered, as though even they wanted no part in what came next. Deadman's Hollow had seen men hang, women weep, blood stain the dust until it turned the color of rust. But this was different. The fire ate fast, hungry, like it had been waiting years to be fed. And the people who woke to see the glow from their windows would later swear they smelled brimstone on the wind. Some said she was a widow gone mad, others whispered she was a witch. Yet when they saw her silhouette against the burning grave, revolver at her hip, coat whipping in the wind, they knew one thing for certain: she hadn't come for forgiveness. She hadn't come for peace, she had come for reckoning. And the Hollow, with its broken saloon doors and its streets paved with lies, was about to learn that the dead don't stay buried, not when she's the one doing the digging. Her name was spoken like a curse and a prayer, both in the same breath. Men spat it in anger, women whispered it in fear, and children heard it in the hush of their mothers' warnings. But in the smoke of that burning grave, her name was something else entirely, a promise. What she carried in her saddlebag that night wasn't gold, nor letters, nor keepsakes from a man she loved. No, it was heavier. It was darker. A secret etched in ink, stamped with the seal of men who thought themselves untouchable. She carried their lies, their orders, their sins, and for that, they would come hunting her before dawn. But even in the chase, she'd make sure of one thing: they'd feel the fire before she ever did. Deadman's Hollow would remember her not as the woman who burned a coffin, but as the storm that burned the whole town down. The Hollow wasn't built to last. It was carved out of the earth by men with shovels and dynamite, chasing veins of silver that dried up before the ink on the town charter was even set. By the time she rode in, Deadman's Hollow was half-rotted wood and broken glass, a town leaning on memory more than money. Saloon lamps still burned, but dim, as if afraid to waste the oil. The church bell hadn't rung in years. And the air, thick, heavy, smelling of coal smoke and rust, carried the weight of something unspoken. It was the kind of place where silence told more stories than words, the kind of place where strangers didn't ride in unless they had ghosts at their heels. 0548. She came at sundown, horse staggering under the miles, her cloak torn to ribbons by wind and thorn. Dust clung to her face, but her eyes, sharp, unyielding, burned hotter than the horizon fire that bled across the sky. Every hoofbeat on that dry, splintered Main Street rang louder than a church hymn. Men leaning on the porch rails of the saloon stopped talking. Women carrying water paused, buckets swaying midair. And children, the few who still roamed the Hollow, scattered like leaves on a storm wind. The saddlebag chained to her side shifted with each step of her horse, heavy, metallic, locked. None dared ask what was in it, but all of them felt it. Felt it the way you feel a storm rolling in long before the thunder breaks. The saloon doors creaked as she passed. Whiskey glasses froze in midair. A piano that had been tinkling off-key fell silent with the player's trembling hands. Eyes followed her, some wide with fear, others narrowed with hate. Whispers slipped between teeth, but they didn't carry far, not at first. Then one name rose above the others, cracked and rasping from a throat soaked in liquor. A drunk in the corner slumped forward, eyes glazed but voice sharp as broken glass. "She's back," he muttered, too loud to be ignored. A hush swept the room like wind through tall grass, and then he added, with a smile that wasn't a smile at all, "And hell's with her." The words hung there, heavy, poisonous, undeniable. Outside, the wind shifted. The sky darkened. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Upstairs at the inn, the floorboards groaned with every step, like the building itself wanted to warn her away. She dropped a few tarnished coins on the counter, never lifting her eyes to the clerk, and took the key without a word. The hallway smelled of mildew, of cheap perfume long since faded, of secrets sealed into wood. Her boots echoed as she reached the room at the end, the one where the wallpaper peeled like dead skin. She closed the door behind her and bolted it. For the first time since she rode into Deadman's Hollow, the room was still. No voices. No whispers. Only the sound of her breath, ragged, deliberate. She knelt by the bed, dragging the saddlebag across the floor. The chain scraped like a serpent uncoiling. She didn't open it all at once. Not yet. She eased it into her lap, hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what lay inside. From the bag, she pulled a letter, its edges scorched, its folds blackened by fire. The paper flaked in her grip, as though it might crumble into ash if she breathed too hard. She unfolded it slowly, carefully, and let her eyes run across words that had been written in haste, in terror. But the audience, the world beyond that room, only ever caught fragments. Half-sentences, torn by flame. The one that mattered most bled through the silence. "They'll come for you at the river." She shut her eyes tight, as if the words themselves carried venom. Outside, a storm cracked across the sky, thunder shaking the glass in the window. She folded the letter back on itself, pressing it flat against her chest. Not a love note. Not a farewell. A warning. A dying man's last gift, or curse. Either way, it was hers now. She tucked the letter back into the saddlebag, locking it tight with the chain, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floorboards. The whispers outside the saloon, the stares on the street, they weren't about gold, or silver, or whiskey. No, they were about her. She hadn't ridden into Deadman's Hollow for business, or trade, or shelter. She'd come for vengeance. And vengeance had a way of drawing blood in every direction. Downstairs, boots scuffed across the saloon floor. Laughter rose, sharp and jagged, like knives scraping stone. The sound slithered up through the boards. She reached for her revolver, thumb brushing the worn handle, but didn't draw. Not yet. She stood, moved toward the window, and stopped dead. There, nailed to the wall across the street, flapping in the rising wind, a bounty poster. The ink was fresh, the paper unweathered. And staring back from it, was her own face. The gunshot came sharp, splitting the air like a lightning crack. In Deadman's Hollow, sound traveled slow through the dust, but this one was different. It carried weight, the kind that makes a room fall silent before the echo even fades. She didn't wait. Her boots hit the street boards before the drinkers inside could lift their heads. The night was heavy, the kind of heavy that pressed down on a town already waiting for its coffin lid. Smoke curled off the rooftops from lamps burning too late. The shot had come from the alley, and in that kind of darkness, you didn't find mistakes, you found intent. She pushed forward, hand brushing the revolver at her hip, knowing already whatever waited was meant for her. In the alley, shadows clung like old debts. The stench of coal smoke mixed with wet iron, the kind of smell that never lied. Blood. She found him slumped against the wall, a badge glinting weakly on his chest. His breath rattled, eyes wide, fixed on her like she was the ghost he'd been waiting for. He coughed red and managed words, each one cracking like dry timber. "It wasn't your fault." The train, then silence, save the wet choke of a man too far gone. Her heart hammered. The train? What train? His hand twitched against hers like he wanted to give more, to confess the whole of it, but his strength bled into the dirt. She leaned closer, desperate for the rest, for the answer he was dying to put in her hands, but the night wasn't kind. Out of the dark, something moved. A figure, faceless, the edge of a coat brushing the wet stones. Before she could raise her gun, the man's throat snapped under a knife that glimmered once in the moonlight, then vanished. His body sagged. Gone. She raised her revolver, but the shadow was faster, retreating into the black with a silence that screamed trained hands, not drunken rage. She cursed the stillness, cursed the town that held too many secrets. The dying man's badge slid off his chest, clinking against the stone. She picked it up, turned it in her palm, and froze. It was scratched, the kind of deep carving that made it worthless in any lawman's hand. This wasn't the sheriff's badge at all. Not the man sworn to keep order, but someone else entirely. A decoy. A warning. Or worse, bait. She looked back down the alley, the darkness swallowing every trace of the killer. Somewhere in that silence, a truth had been stolen from her. Somewhere in that silence, someone knew she was hunting answers, and they weren't about to let her live long enough to hear them. The badge felt heavy now, too heavy, as if it carried not law, but the first shovelful of her grave. The night hadn't finished with her. By the time she left the alley, the moon had sunk lower, pulling the shadows long and mean across Deadman's Hollow. But the ground still told its story. Fresh hoofprints cut deep into the dust, dragging east, toward the black cut of the canyon folk whispered about but never entered. They called it Deadman's Gulch, and not because the name sounded pretty. They said the ground there was greedy, that once it tasted blood it never forgot. She rode anyway, her cloak snapping like a torn flag in the wind. The hoofprints were too fresh, too deliberate, as if whoever rode ahead wanted her to follow. And that was the thing that kept her spine tight. When a trail was too easy, it was never a trail. It was a trap. The canyon closed around her, walls rising like gravestones, the air sharp with the smell of stone and old gunpowder. Her horse shifted beneath her, ears twitching. Animals always knew before men did. That was when the first shot cracked, a spark flashing from the rocks above. Her horse screamed, legs folding under the storm of bullets. She hit the ground hard, the taste of dust and iron in her mouth, rolling before another shot tore the earth where her head had been. The canyon came alive with echoes, each one louder than the last. Ambush. They had her penned in, a bird in a cage with nowhere to fly. She dragged herself behind a jagged slab of rock, chest heaving, hand on her revolver. The horse lay still now, silence closing its mouth forever. Breath by breath, she pressed herself tighter against the stone, waiting. Waiting for the killers to rush her. But they didn't. They fired in rhythm, not to kill, but to herd. To corner. The air grew hotter with every shot, fragments of rock raining down like sparks. She slid across the dirt, boots scraping, crawling toward a shadowed hollow at the base of the cliff. Fingers clawed through the grit until they found something cold. Metal. She pulled it free, not a weapon, not a bullet. A locket, silver, worn smooth at the edges. She opened it with shaking hands, ready to toss it if it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Inside, the faces stared back at her. Kane's face, and her own. Her blood iced. She snapped the locket shut, her pulse hammering louder than the gunfire. Kane, the man she'd been chasing, the name that haunted her sleep, and her, locked together inside a token like they were bound by more than vengeance. But Kane wasn't supposed to carry a locket. He was supposed to carry a badge. She pulled the scratched metal badge from her pocket, the one taken off the dying man. Turned it over in the dim canyon light. No, not Kane's. It had never been Kane's. Someone else wore it. Someone else was playing lawman in the dark, and that meant one thing: she wasn't just chasing Kane anymore. She was being hunted by ghosts who knew her face better than she did. Dawn crept slow over Deadman's Hollow, a pale light that didn't warm so much as reveal. It slid across the canyon, through the trees, down to the river where fog hung thick as a burial shroud. Her boots sank deep in the mud as she followed the trail, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in her head. But it wasn't bullets that stopped her cold, it was the earth itself. A mound, fresh turned, the soil damp, darker than the rest. A grave. Too new to be forgotten, too shallow to be natural. And on top of it, catching the morning light, a hat, wide-brimmed, sweat-stained, the crown split and painted with blood. Kane's hat. The man she had chased across counties, across deserts, across nightmares, his name whispered through gun smoke, now marked by a grave that might have already swallowed him whole. She dropped to her knees, fingers clawing at the soil before her mind caught up with her body. The narrator's voice tightened, the man she hunted might already be in the ground. Her hands moved faster, pulling away the damp clumps, nails breaking, skin tearing against stone. But the deeper she dug, the more wrong it felt. There was no body. No bones. No man. Instead, the edge of something unyielding struck her palm. Wood. She cleared the dirt, breath ragged, until the outline came into view. A box. Old timber, locked shut with iron, buried not by chance but by choice. She dragged it free, the soil clinging to its sides like it wanted to keep it hidden. And then she saw the marks. Not the marks of time, not the scars of weather. But letters. Carved by a hand that knew her name, her blood, her history. Her initials. Etched deep into the lid, staring back at her in the dim light of dawn. This was no accident. This wasn't Kane's grave. This was her message. Her warning. Or maybe her trap. The lock on the box was cold, unbroken, daring her to open it. Her hands hovered, trembling, every part of her screaming to pry it open and yet knowing that whatever waited inside would change everything. She sat back, the hat still resting on the grave, the fog curling low and thick around her like hands reaching for her throat. A bird called once across the river and then fell silent. She gripped the box to her chest, and the scene froze in silence. What was buried for her was not yet ready to be seen. Not yet. The truth would wait, but not forever. Night crept over the plains the way smoke creeps through rafters, slow, curling, and inescapable. She remembered a night long before Deadman's Hollow, before graves and bloodied hats, before she carried the weight of names whispered like curses. The fire that night was small, almost dying, its flames snapping against the cold wind. She and Kane had sat close, shoulders brushing, the smell of iron and blood still fresh from the bounty they'd hunted down together. It wasn't romance that held them in place, not at first. It was exhaustion, the kind that digs into the bone. Yet in the crackle of the fire and the silence that stretched between them, something else had taken root. He had leaned closer, the brim of his hat casting shadows across his scarred jaw, and whispered her name like it meant salvation. And when she turned, their lips met, moonlight spilling down, firelight fading, the world pausing just long enough for two killers to remember they were human. But Kane was never a man to let softness linger. His hand rested on her cheek, but his voice, low, steady, carved out of stone, carried a warning. If the day comes you can't trust me, make sure you're the one to pull the trigger. The words struck colder than the desert night, embedding themselves deep, a brand she could never shake. She had laughed it off at the time, pressing her forehead to his, telling him trust wasn't so easy to lose. But even then, in the hush of that fire, she had felt it, a tension coiled beneath his calm, a shadow in his eyes that said he already knew trust would break between them. That kiss, slow and burning, tasted of smoke and inevitability. She hadn't known then how much she'd come to fear the truth of his warning, or how soon she'd carry the weight of it into the graveyards of her memory. Thunder cracked, pulling her back to the present. The fire, the kiss, Kane's voice, all of it snuffed out by the storm rolling over the canyon. She blinked, and the memory bled into the night around her, into the darkness where hoofbeats trembled against the earth. Riders. More than one. Coming fast. She clutched the box she'd dug from the grave tighter, her heart hammering with the echo of Kane's words. If the day comes you can't trust me. The wind carried dust and the scent of rain, her cloak whipping against her side. In the shadows beyond the ridge, the riders drew closer, their silhouettes breaking through the mist. The fire of her memory was gone, but its ash lingered. And the thunder wasn't just in the sky, it was in the ground, in the coming storm of men who hunted her, each second narrowing the distance between life and reckoning. The canyon was a throat of stone, narrow and echoing with the weight of silence. She rode in slow, every hoofbeat swallowed by the walls around her. The sky above was only a slit of fading light, smoke trailing along the horizon as though the earth itself smoldered. She felt it before she saw them, the hush of air shifting, the tremor of hooves that didn't belong to hers. Then the smoke thickened, not from fire, but from gunpowder. They came sudden, masked riders bursting from the rock like specters, rifles raised, bandanas hiding every mark of who they truly were, the canyon lit with thunder. Bullets carved the stone, the air, the edge of her coat. She pulled her revolver without thought, her body moving the way it had learned through 1,000 battles. One shot rang, another followed, and a rider fell, his scream swallowed by the canyon's throat. But the fight didn't end with the echo. Dust and smoke rolled through the gorge, choking her vision, drowning the world in fire and shadow. She spurred forward, cutting through the haze, until another rider came too close. She pulled him down, both of them crashing into the dirt. His mask tore, his eyes wild with something that wasn't just fear, it was desperation. She pressed the barrel of her revolver to his chest, her voice a rasp through clenched teeth, "Who sent you?" He spat dust, coughed, and whispered like a dying man clutching confession, "The lawman's not who you think." The words curdled in the air, more dangerous than the bullet she hadn't fired. She blinked, the canyon spinning with smoke and storm. But before the truth could unfold, before she could pry another word from his throat, the world behind her shifted. A hand, unseen, merciless, shoved hard. The ground vanished beneath her. The canyon's edge gave way, and she was weightless for a heartbeat, the masked rider's eyes shrinking above as she fell. The river below yawned wide, black as oil, roaring like a beast that had waited only for her. She struck water with a force that shattered breath from her chest, dragging her under, deeper and deeper, where light could not follow. Smoke dissolved into bubbles. Sound became silence. The last thing she saw before the current dragged her into darkness was the face of the rider she'd spared, watching her vanish, his words still hanging in the air like an unbroken curse, "The lawman's not who you think." Then the river swallowed everything. Fade to black. The river had no mercy, but it had its own kind of judgment. It dragged her through black water and stone, spinning her in silence until the world itself seemed to end. When at last it spat her onto the mud of its banks, she lay as though dead, chest rising only because fate had not yet claimed her. The night was quiet save for the hiss of water retreating back into its channel. And there, a few feet from her hand, was a saddlebag. Leather torn, straps darkened by blood and years of travel. She knew it at once, she had seen it across countless fires, strapped to Cain's horse, guarded as though it were his soul itself. And now, washed up beside her like some offering from the river's hand, it bore his initials carved deep in the flap. She dragged it close, fingers trembling, half afraid of what she might find. The buckle was stiff, rust biting into its edge, but it gave way under her pull. Inside, the smell of gun oil and dust rose like memory itself. First she found cartridges, each one polished, packed with care, the kind of bullets Cain had always kept for the jobs that mattered most. Then a silver watch, its surface cracked but still ticking faintly, keeping time long after its master had vanished. She held it to her ear, and the sound was steady, accusing, but it was the last item that stole the breath from her lungs. Folded, sealed, and bearing the mark of authority, a warrant. Her name written bold across it. The wax was unbroken. The signature beneath undeniable. Cain's. The fire in her chest roared louder than the river ever had. Why? Why would his name mark the order that condemned her? Was it betrayal, cold, deliberate, and merciless? Or had he signed it to shield her, to twist the law's gaze away with some plan she could not yet see? Her hand shook as she held the paper near the dying moonlight. One tear, one crack in the wax, and she would know. But she did not break the seal. Not yet. She could not. Instead, she stared at the saddlebag, the cartridges, the silver watch, relics of a man who haunted her every step, and felt the hollow pull of the cliff's edge once more. Somewhere between loyalty and vengeance, love and death, the truth waited like a rattler in the dark. And Deadman's Hollow had never been kind to secrets. The storm had been chasing her for miles, but now it had caught her. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the earth, soaking the boards of an old church that leaned like a dying man against the hillside. Its steeple was cracked, its windows black, hollow sockets staring at her as if the place itself knew who she was and why she had come. She followed the track straight to its door, mud-caked boot prints vanishing into darkness. Lightning split the sky, a white slash that lit the broken cross still clinging to the roof. Her hand hovered near her revolver, not from fear, but from the certainty that someone was already waiting inside. The kind of waiting that carried patience, and knowledge, and a debt that had yet to be paid. She pushed the door. It groaned, heavy, as if reluctant to give her passage. Inside, the church smelled of rain and wood rot, every pew overturned, every hymn book long since ruined. Water dripped steadily from holes in the roof, pooling on the floorboards that creaked beneath her steps. Each sound echoed in the cavernous dark, a hollow prayer to no God that ever listened. She thought she was alone until she saw the faintest flicker of movement, shadow shifting in shadow. And then, from the far corner, a shape pulled free of the darkness. A man, older now, beaten by time and battles unseen, yet unmistakable. Cain. His eyes caught the light of another flash of lightning, and they burned with something between regret and defiance. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't step forward. He simply spoke, and the words carried across the ruined sanctuary like a confession whispered at the gallows. "You should have read the back of that warrant." His voice was rough, frayed like rope dragged through sand, yet steady in a way that told her he meant every word. Her grip tightened on her revolver, but her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. That warrant, signed in his hand, had been the reason she came. The reason blood had been spilled, the reason graves were dug shallow and fast. Now he stood there, bruised, scarred, and older, but not broken. He stared at her as if daring her to answer, daring her to remember what she'd missed. He stepped into the light that poured from a hole in the roof, rain streaking across his face, dripping down his jaw. "It was the only way," he said, quieter now, though no less certain. "The only way to keep you alive." The words cut deeper than any bullet could. Thunder rolled, and the church shuddered with the sound. She wanted to believe him, wanted to remember the man who once told her to trust no one but him, but the shadows between them carried too many secrets, too many graves, too much silence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her finger brushed the trigger, and in that moment the storm outside felt small compared to the one rising in her chest. The storm had not let go of the valley. It pressed against the church walls, rattled the shattered windows, poured through the broken roof as though heaven itself had come to watch. Lightning clawed across the sky, illuminating two figures bound not just by memory, but by blood spilled on soil too bitter to forget. Cain's breath was ragged, his shoulder scarred with battles she hadn't seen. And yet, his voice cut through the storm with a steadiness that made the air tremble. "It wasn't me," he said. "It was never me. The one you've been hunting, the one who marked us both, it's the railroad. They framed me. They framed you. Every grave you passed, every man who swore your name in his last breath, they put it there." His words landed heavy, like earth shoveled over a coffin, and for a moment, the silence inside the church was heavier than the thunder outside. She stood frozen, the warrant in her mind, the graves she'd dug with her own hands, the faces of the dead etched against her eyelids. The railroad. It made sense, too much sense. The missing shipments, the fires, the contracts that disappeared into smoke. But sense did not ease the ache of betrayal. Not after years of chasing him through dust and blood. "If you stay," Cain's voice lowered, a plea hidden beneath steel, "you'll die here. They've already marked this place. By dawn, there'll be nothing left but ashes and bones. If you leave, if you ride hard and don't look back, you might just make it to morning." His eyes never left hers. Not fear. Not command. Just truth, carved into every word. The storm leaned harder on the church, and the drip of rain turned to a steady stream soaking the floorboards. She could smell the damp wood, hear the groan of beams ready to give way. His words clawed at her chest, tore at everything she had carried this far. Walk away. Live. But to live meant leaving the fight unfinished, leaving every grave unaccounted for, every lie unchallenged. And to stay meant standing shoulder to shoulder with a man she no longer knew if she could trust. Her hand brushed the revolver at her side, not to draw it, but to remind herself it was there, that choice was still hers. She stepped closer, boots sinking into the soaked boards, her breath catching in the pause between lightning and thunder. Kane's shadow loomed tall in the flicker of stormlight, but he didn't move. His voice dropped again, steady, low, final. This isn't about you, or me. It never was. They'll burn towns, bury names, erase every soul who dares stand in their path. Tonight, they'll come for both of us. You think you're hunting me, but you've been walking straight into their fire. The words rang cold, the kind that carved themselves into bone. Thunder rolled once more, shaking the church, the storm announcing its judgment. She did not answer. Not yet, but she stepped closer, one step, then another, into the space where lightning carved the truth across his face, into the place where trust and betrayal lived side by side, waiting for her hand to decide which road she would take before dawn. The storm had not let go of the valley. It pressed against the church walls, rattled the shattered windows, poured through the broken roof as though heaven itself had come to watch. Lightning clawed across the sky, illuminating two figures bound not just by memory, but by blood spilled on soil too bitter to forget. Kane's breath was ragged, his shoulder scarred with battle she hadn't seen. And yet, his voice cut through the storm with a steadiness that made the air tremble. It wasn't me, he said. It was never me. The one you've been hunting, the one who marked us both, it's the railroad. They framed me. They framed you. Every grave you passed, every man who swore your name in his last breath, they put it there. His words landed heavy, like earth shoveled over a coffin, and for a moment, the silence inside the church was heavier than the thunder outside. She stood frozen, the warrant in her mind, the graves she'd dug with her own hands, the faces of the dead etched against her eyelids. The railroad. It made sense, too much sense. The missing shipments, the fires, the contracts that disappeared into smoke. But sense did not ease the ache of betrayal. Not after years of chasing him through dust and blood. If you stay, Kane's voice lowered, a plea hidden beneath steel, you'll die here. They've already marked this place. By dawn, there'll be nothing left but ashes and bones. If you leave, if you ride hard and don't look back, you might just make it to morning. His eyes never left hers. Not fear. Not command. Just truth, carved into every word. The storm leaned harder on the church, and the drip of rain turned to a steady stream soaking the floorboards. She could smell the damp wood, hear the groan of beams ready to give way. His words clawed at her chest, tore at everything she had carried this far. Walk away. Live. But to live meant leaving the fight unfinished, leaving every grave unaccounted for, every lie unchallenged. And to stay meant standing shoulder to shoulder with a man she no longer knew if she could trust. Her hand brushed the revolver at her side, not to draw it, but to remind herself it was there, that choice was still hers. She stepped closer, boots sinking into the soaked boards, her breath catching in the pause between lightning and thunder. Kane's shadow loomed tall in the flicker of stormlight, but he didn't move. His voice dropped again, steady, low, final. This isn't about you, or me. It never was. They'll burn towns, bury names, erase every soul who dares stand in their path. Tonight, they'll come for both of us. You think you're hunting me, but you've been walking straight into their fire. The words rang cold, the kind that carved themselves into bone. Thunder rolled once more, shaking the church, the storm announcing its judgment. She did not answer. Not yet, but she stepped closer, one step, then another, into the space where lightning carved the truth across his face, into the place where trust and betrayal lived side by side, waiting for her hand to decide which road she would take before dawn. The night had burned itself out, and dawn crept slow over the hollow. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean, but not the souls who walked it. She rode alone, the reins loose in her hands, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind her, the church stood broken, bleeding shadows through its shattered windows. They'd say she left him standing there, abandoned in ruin, but they'd be wrong. A part of her never left that night, bound to him by secrets too heavy for daylight. The sun caught her face in fleeting gold, but her heart still lingered in darkness. In the dust of the churchyard lay a torn scrap of parchment, the warrant, the one that bore her name in Kane's hand. Wind rolled it across the ground, edges frayed, ink smudged by rain and blood alike. She hadn't looked back, but she knew it was there, waiting for whoever came next. Proof of betrayal, or salvation, depending on who found it. The riders would come, and when they did, they would see her trail. She hadn't vanished. She had only slipped into the wide silence, carrying both guilt and defiance with her. And there, in the broken shadow of the doorway, Cain lingered. Wounded, leaning hard against the splintered wood, but alive. His eyes followed her until she was nothing but a blur against the rising sun. He didn't call her name. Didn't beg her to stop. He only whispered to the silence, to the ghosts that gathered close around him, "This isn't the end." His hand tightened around the revolver she'd pressed into his palm. A weapon, yes, but also a burden. One he couldn't lift against her, not then, not ever. The trail stretched wide ahead, a road made of dust and whispers. And though she rode into the light, the story wasn't finished. The wind carried a promise, of hoofbeats, of reckoning, of trails that always circle back. Some claimed that was the last anyone saw of her. But the truth? She never really left Deadman's Hollow. Her shadow lingered, stitched into its soil, waiting for the day paths would cross again. And that was not the last time they crossed paths. The West is wide, and its stories are never done. For every gunshot that echoes, for every grave that marks the sand, another tale waits to ride out of the smoke. If you want to ride the next trail, if you want to know what waits in the silence of Deadman's Hollow, subscribe. Because the dust never settles, and there's always another story waiting in the shadows.